What's actually going on there when you upload a file, or where is that?
So I think it's really just being more cautious about what we upload to systems.
I suppose there is still a risk there, right? G'day and welcome to Bit by Bit, a podcast by Vokke, where we help executives and business owners learn about tech topics and insights and break them down bit by bit. My name's Jon. I'm joined here today by Adrian. Adrian, what are we talking about today?
Today's episode, we're talking about data sovereignty, data centers, and the fundamental questions organizations can ask themselves to best handle their data.
All right, well, look, I'd like to start with a question that I often get when we're putting in proposals for software projects, which is people often ask me, where is the data held? Which is a great question, because it's not a question really that we used to get, right? Like we used to... A few years ago, no one really seemed to ask or care about this kind of thing. I think now there's just so many security exploits, so many data leaks that are happening from really large companies that people are really conscious about where their data is and how it's protected and stored securely. But I thought with that question, it might be a really good chance for us to dive into that a little bit deeper and talk about, well, where is data held when you're using a piece of software? Whether that be something maybe that someone's built themselves or where they're just using an off-the-shelf product, perhaps Slack or something like that, and what's actually going on there when you upload a file or you send a message. Where is that and what's going on?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So we call that term typically data sovereignty. Where does it sit and whose jurisdiction does it fall under? And it's increasingly more important because companies are realizing that data is a big asset and they're starting to actually govern it with laws. Legal frameworks, right? Now, this has happened for a while. We have the Australian privacy principles, among others. America has Patriot Act. There's all different guidelines around the world that indicate what you need to do to protect data, depending on the level of risk and what it contains. And many people are concerned about storing data in other countries because it technically will fall under their jurisdiction, right? So you end up now with many countries dictating that certain types of data have to sit onshore or with equivalent privacy frameworks or an equivalent of that. So it's a very interesting question from that respect. The other one I think purely comes down to who's managing it on my behalf, right? Is my data safe? And that's not necessarily safe from the law, but rather is it safe in the sense of it's protected from hackers, it's being handled responsibly, it's being backed up, all of that stuff. Even if that's not consciously the question that's being asked, I think subconsciously it's like, is my data cared for?
Yes, is it safe?
And look, it's actually a complex answer. Where is my data held? I mean, there's two ways to look at that. You could say there's the in transit and at rest. Right. Okay. Data in transit means when I'm using a web product, say Figma or Office 365, it's obviously moving over the internet.
Okay.
Right. Now, the internet is a disaggregated set of machines all around the world, and typically your internet traffic can traverse who knows what path to get to where. Right. But assuming we'll leave that for a different conversation, we'll say where's it sitting once it's arrived. Right. That's usually stored in a place called a data center. They're amazing places to visit. I encourage everyone, if you have never seen a data center, read up on it. It's amazing. Essentially, it's a massive warehouse full of thousands and thousands of computers. It's very loud. Typically, you need headphones when you go in there, or earphones. It's amazing, just, I think, an engineering feat that we've done that. But data actually sits in data centers.
Okay.
So here in Melbourne, don't quote me on this, but we might have like 7 or 8. In every major city around the world, there's typically a few data centers, and they're connected either under the ocean cables or cross land cables, and that forms the internet, also the cloud. Now, it's an interesting term, the cloud, because I think it kind of pushes this idea about machines and computers to the periphery where people just think it's somewhere, right? But at the end of the day, it is stored in a computer, in a data center somewhere. And it's up to the person who's developing the software to figure out where they want to store it. So if you're engaging with Slack or Figma or some other product, you're trusting that they've made a decision appropriately about where to put that data and how to handle it. Now, there's international certifications that help guide this. ISO 27001 is one of them, right? It's an information security management system framework. We're certified at Vokke. AWS is certified, Azure is certified, and that provides some independent guarantee about the way people are handling your data. But ultimately, where it sits is up to the vendor, right? So, we have some clients where we have to store it in Australia for legal reasons. We have other clients who need it in other countries for other reasons. Yeah, I think in terms of where it sits, again, it is a complex answer, but it typically anywhere in the world. And that's really, that may not be the answer you're looking for, but I think that answer does highlight the fact that people do need to care and they need to ask the question because different people store it in different places, which means it's protected by different laws, right?
So how then does, say you're using, well, just use Slack as an example, right? Like you're trying to assess a software product and you want to know this. I mean, how do you find out where the data's stored, what are you looking for to know that that's okay, they're handling this in the right way, that they're storing it appropriately. Well, I guess to the average user like me, how do I have confidence in that?
Yeah, it's a great one. I think first assess the risks. Why do you care, right? Do you care because you've got some legal compliance framework you have to abide by? Australian privacy principles, for example. Or do you care because you need to just make sure your data is well cared for, even if it's in the United States, right? If it's from a compliance reason, typically the organisations will publish it. Good organisations tell you where the data is. They even offer multiple locations, right? So Google, for example, has multiple choices if you want. Other organisations as well, they'll say, you can choose where your data sits so that you can be compliant to the GDPR or the Australian privacy principles or whatever you're interested in. If you're more concerned about, this might be some startup and you don't particularly care where it sits, but you just want to make sure it's well maintained, a good thing to look for is certifications, third-party evidence that they're following a framework, and then usually, again, they'll publish some indications as to what policies and things like that they've adopted. Basic things like HTTPS and all that, but also when you're using the product, just try and figure out, you'll be able to tell probably within there where the data sits. They might tell you, for example, this is, stored in America, or this is, when you start using it.
And what about, you hear the terms public cloud versus private cloud. What's the difference there and why does that matter?
It's funny, the term public cloud, I think, was, when that was coined, I think people didn't like it because public means everyone can use it, right? It inherently sounds insecure, so the word was dropped and we end up with the word cloud. The cloud, typically, depending on the definition you want to adopt, but you're using someone else's resources, or you're using resources that can scale elastically and you can use them on demand. The public cloud means you're using infrastructure that is available to everyone and you're leasing or renting it for a portion of time. I might pay per minute, per hour, per second for a compute resource. Public cloud players are Amazon, Azure, Google, those parties. Private cloud typically means it's a cloud environment but provisioned just for your use or isolated use. So you might, in your data center, have all the equipment set up. You can still create virtual machines and all these other technical things on demand and scale them with load balancers, but it's just for you. And then you end up with the new world, which is a hybrid cloud, where you integrate either public and public clouds or public and private clouds together. And that really seems to be what a lot of organizations are adopting because you get the benefit of both. You get elasticity, you get the investments from all these different companies, and the standards do allow typically for forms of interconnection. So it's a very interesting world. I mean, people do just say the word cloud. I think that's typically the phrase, and they typically mean public. That seems to be the implication. But definitely there's hundreds of companies out there that have set up private cloud infrastructure and are relying on hybrid clouds as well. Yeah.
And I guess as an end user using the product, do I care which is being used? Is that something I should be checking and assessing or not relevant?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, probably not. I think you more care about do companies care about your data and handle them with respect, right? Whether it sits in Perth or Melbourne or even the United States, I think it's probably more what's the philosophy behind the company and do they care, right? We all know that, what's that saying? If you're not paying for the product, what is it? You're the product? Is that
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we all know data is valuable. We all know that. Right. We all also probably know that companies use it in ways that sometimes we don't like. So I think it's, but that's not the data center that's guiding that, nor is it the country it's necessarily stored in. That's the ethos of the company. So I think it's really just being more cautious about what we upload to systems and then just having some vetting process by which I think this system is worth the trade-off, right? Do I give this system my information for the benefit I get?
Yeah.
And the risk. And obviously some things about your life will be more risky than others.
Yeah, I think one thing that is interesting about it is this trend of how before, I guess pre-cloud, everyone pretty much had servers in their office, right? This idea of being on premises, and that also meant then you had to handle a bunch of things. You had to make sure that it was safe. You had to make sure it was actually running. You had to make sure that you were doing backups and those kinds of things. And I suppose part of the idea of the cloud is to abstract that away and say, look, I'm not going to worry about some of those things. Some you still have to worry about, but it does, to me anyway, feel like it means that for the majority of people, they don't think of it as a concern anymore, right? Because someone else is handling it. But I suppose there is still a risk there, right? You could still say, well, that product you're using, Slack or something else, I feel like this is now an advertisement for Slack. I've said it that many times. It's just what's coming to mind. Whatever off-the-shelf product you're using, you're trusting them, right? At the end of the day, you just have to trust that they actually are backing it up, as just one example, as frequently as they say, and that they're testing that they can restore those backups and things like that. There's a whole bunch of things, I suppose, that you're really just outsourcing, aren't you?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, in programming, we actually have a term for this concept. It's called a leaky abstraction.
Right.
And it was coined by Joel Spolsky, actually, the Stack Overflow founder, I believe. But he actually found what we think is a fundamental truth in the world, which is all abstractions are leaky. Right. And what I mean by that is when you buy a car, the engine problem has been solved, right? You can use your car, and you can use the car only knowing a few basic things, actually. How to turn it on, how to drive it, how to maneuver around the world, the roads. You don't have to care about the cylinders in the engine or the thermodynamics that are going on or the fact that the wavefront is moving through the cylinder or anything like that. That's been abstracted away, right? It's been solved. The problem is when your car doesn't work, you don't have enough information to fix it anymore. Now you actually do need to go back down to that level and say, okay, what's wrong with the cylinder?
Yeah, because it hasn't gone away.
It hasn't gone away, exactly. It's been abstracted away. So when the things work well, it's fine. But there are conditions that exist by which you need that information again. And because we have abstracted it from you, you can't fix it, right? So that's called a leaky abstraction in that sense. Now, to the credit of the cloud, and I think a lot of other things, we've tried to abstract away the difficulties of things like hard drives and network protocols and network cables, and that's great. I think for the majority of us, that's a real benefit. But when something goes wrong, I think that's where the problem is. Things can go wrong in ways that we don't expect because we've abstracted the concern away. But also I think it means that we inherently don't even think about it because it's moved away.
That's right.
And I think that's an interesting point. When people get into their car, I don't think they think about a car like that. It doesn't mean the concerns are gone.
Yeah,
So
same as using software, right? They're not thinking about the fact necessarily that there is data being stored and that someone actually doesn't need to be doing
it doesn't
backups.
negate the fact that these are relevant concerns,
Yeah.
right? So an interesting thing with the cloud, for example, is, and maybe true, they are doing security better than you could, right? So that's a concern which is better placed with them, perhaps. But you still need to follow things like how the backup's being done and are they being done correctly and are they being able to be restored and all of this stuff. I think some problems can be safely put in the basket of I don't need to worry anymore about this. Other ones, though, are incorrectly placed in that basket, right? People think that because it's on the cloud, the data will never get corrupted. If you look at the durability ratings of cloud block storage devices, it's not 100%, right? So it's not like the concerns of do I need backups, do I need off-site backups, do they need to be immutable? They're still 100% there. Cloud providers try and facilitate the answers to those questions, but I think there's 100% truth in what you're saying, and that's like, I think some things still need to be considered and they're not actively considered.
I think it's quite scary because often, I guess, you want to just sign up for a product, you want to just use it, you want to not worry about those things. And to your point, because they're not something that most of us deal with day to day, they don't come to mind, right? And that's usually where I guess the IT department of a company will hopefully have a checklist of things right before signing up for something. But it reminds me of a mutual colleague of ours who told us that story where they were using, I think it was a learning management system, and they've been loading up data and using it for 6 months, a year, something like that. And then one day they got a phone call. And the person on the other end said, look, I'm so sorry, but we've had an issue and we've lost your data. And this person just said, that's okay, that these things happen, just restore a backup and it'll all be fine. And they said, no, we've lost everything. We don't have the backups, right? And they just lost absolutely everything. And it's an interesting example to me where it's not something you would really think about being a risk in your business, but it absolutely is one, and it's something that has to be done. But the difference is now you don't actually have control over it, right? It's a counterparty risk that they have to manage that. It's still your risk, and you have no control over it to be able to mitigate it. It's quite scary, really.
It is, and not knowing it exists and putting it in the hands of someone else doesn't obviate you from having to care. Or it doesn't mean that it's not a thing. You're totally right. I think that, I don't know what that industry or that company, put in place. But I think that often IT companies and vendors don't do enough to secure people's data. I think people think that one backup is fine, but that's it. But there's actually a whole framework about how to do these things properly. I think there's a shortcoming on that front. But I think education-wise, I think people should start to care. I mean, some people use software at its core driver of their business, right? That's a fundamental question. If your data disappears, what happens?
Yeah.
Again, some frameworks, ISO 9001, helps this by saying your suppliers need to be evaluated, and if they're holding critical data assets or critical cyber assets, they need to undergo an evaluation. Yes. And you need to be asking that question, right? So we ask that for our vendors that hold reasonable amounts of data. Many companies are starting to do that as well, but more people should be doing it because you can see, and this, I've heard this over and over again, is companies can topple for no fault of their own, but because one of their vendors has gone and their data is gone with them.
Yeah, and I think also taking it upon yourself to do things like back up the data yourself too, right? Rather than just saying, look, it's their responsibility. At the end of the day, if there's a problem if it's going to affect you in a catastrophic way, well, then you can also take steps, right?
Yeah,
you can be doing backups yourself on that, most of the time anyway, and then at least you've mitigated that risk to a degree, right?
100%. I mean, it's a very simple game you play, right? Imagine you wake up tomorrow and all your data is gone from a particular vendor. What position are you in, right? Now, if you are, I probably shouldn't say the word, but if you're in a lot of trouble as a result of that very trivial game, there needs to be some control in place.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you can either treat it, absorb it, whatever you want to do, but you have to do something. And you just have to figure out how. Are you going to pay the vendor to do it? Are you going to do it? Are you going to move
That's
vendors?
right. You've got to ask the question.
You have to ask the question, because if you don't, the risk is still there. You're just playing a dice roll game. And there's been plenty of examples where some of the large companies on earth do lose data. It doesn't happen. It's when will it happen and who will it happen to.
Yeah, and it's almost as though it's just something that a lot of people don't think about every day until it's a problem, right?
Yes.
And then all of a sudden it's the worst problem in the world.
Yes, exactly.
I think as well, to your point before around a lot of these vendors that you may use don't necessarily put enough of an emphasis on these things. To me, it's one of these things where, because traditionally people haven't worried so much about this, or at least haven't for some time, it has probably not made sense for companies to invest, right? There's this real relationship between those things where they can say, okay, well, we're going to go spend $1 million on beefing up our security. At the end of the day, is that actually going to make them more sales, retain customers for longer? And before now, that's felt like a lot of the time that may not be the case, and therefore that it hasn't justified the investment, at least comparative to the idea they could spend that same money on something else, right? Marketing a new feature or something different. Because now people care so much about it, or at least they're starting to. It's one of those top questions that get asked, that I think what that does is it puts the onus on the company to say, well, if we aren't actually going to be investing in those things, we're not going to be competitive.
Yeah, which is a really great move for the industry, I think. And I mean, just to illustrate the point here, I think, some people think that, okay, I've got, clearly one copy of my data is risky. I'm going to have a second one, job done, right? There's many things that still are at fault with that model, right? How often are you testing that this can be restored? I've heard many stories of people taking bad backups for years, right?
Yeah.
You've got 7 years of data, but you can't restore any of it. So how often do you do a recovery test, right? Is this data encrypted, or is it sitting somewhere that, all your sensitive data is just in a zip file ready for downloading, right? Where is this placed? Is it in the same building? For example, at Vokke, we take multiple copies and store them geographically. They're at least 60 kilometres apart, right? We mandate that difference so that they're free from geographical faults, right? Storms, whatever. There's a whole bunch of things. What medium are you storing it on? If you're storing this in the same format as this, what if the format itself has a bug or it gets corrupted, right?
Yeah, wow.
There's all different things you have to consider. And look, the level you choose depends on what you're after, right? But you can see this isn't an easy question.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things that's not an all or nothing thing, right?
It's not,
you do any one of those things and check it, you're in a better position.
100%, yeah.
It's just, like you said, you have to determine, well, how big of a deal is it if we lose this data, and therefore how much we're going to invest in making sure that does not happen.
Exactly.
And it's just a probability game at the end of the day.
Exactly. And, for us, we regularly do a lot of those things just because, for me, I sleep better at night knowing the data is properly safe. But, I also understand that not everyone can do that or even wants to. But at least having a backup or asking the question is a good first step, I think.
Yeah, well, at least what I find in conversations with clients is that most people would choose to invest in those things if they knew about it.
Yeah.
And that's why I guess I wanted to ask you about it and why this is interesting to me, because a lot of the time in business, you treat the risks you know about, or at least you make an assessment, right? You say, look, we know that could happen. I think everyone knows
it's prudent risk management, right?
Yeah, if you've got a key supplier in something like you've got a logistics business and everything's relying on this one vendor, I think anyone in business understands the risk in that, and therefore they would have 2 or 3 options or something. I think when it comes to tech, because it's so hidden, and especially because you have these things like using public cloud providers, which, like you said, kind of hide away a lot of those risks and that complexity, most business owners and executives in general don't really think about those things, in my experience, just because they're hidden away.
Yeah.
But if you know about a risk, well, you can treat the risk, you can mitigate that, right?
Yeah, or at least get enough information to accurately assess it, right?
Yeah, make an informed decision.
Exactly. I think the premise, my data sits with vendor A, therefore safe, is incorrect. I even think the fact that my data sits with Amazon, therefore safe, is incorrect. You can put anyone there, right? It's not even Amazon. My data sits with, any company.
Yeah.
You have to actually ask the question, okay, but how, right? The public cloud doesn't make your things safe indefinitely. At the end of the day, it comes down to who's operating it, how they're operating it, are they doing things like checking it, all of this stuff. But yeah, it's definitely, I think, something we need to be continuing to have discussions about.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks for tuning in today. If you've got a topic you'd love for us to discuss, please get in touch and cover it in a future episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.